So, hi everybody. Today we're going to talk about social emotional development across the ages, going through chapter 10. And we'll kind of look at this content in terms of the realm of social emotional development as a child grows older. And one of the principal things that I think I want to emphasize is the parental role in the evolution of social emotional development through the ages, and looking at how parents' roles are reciprocal with the child. In other words, how the influences of one over the other and vice versa are really important. And we've kind of spoken about that a little bit this semester. There's a kind of a bi-directional relationship between child development and parental influence. So as we look at the emotional expressions, think about the question, does the child have a set of basic emotions at birth based on facial expressions, based on evidence of basic emotions, are kind of controversial because one parent's view of a smile might be actually a baby's gassy tummy. So I think it's really something that many psychologists struggle with in terms of what's present at birth. Most psychologists do agree, though, that by 6 months, you have a variety of emotional responses. The first to appear are startle, distress. And those, I think, too, are very much in the evolutionary process of how we protect ourselves and how infants protect themselves, because they are really, human infants are so helpless, disgust and happiness. And as you go forward in an infant's development, or somewhere around 3 months, you have anger, sadness, interest in objects and things, the environment around them, and surprise. As they go forward, sometime around 7 months, there is a response that you would look at as fear, kind of stranger distress, having people come into their lives. So let's kind of look at a little bit around what those responses might be in terms of emotion when you look at happiness. And it's a reciprocal relationship. Smiles and laughter generate similar responses in the caregiver. And so that person then responds in a reciprocal way, and that increases the strength of the bond between the mom and or the dad or the care person with that infant. Sometime around 6 to 10 weeks, infants smile in response to social in exchanges. And so remember, we are by nature, humans are social animals. And so you look at how we respond even at such a young age, it's quite remarkable. Laughter seems to appear sometime around 3 to 4 months. And again, those are happiness markers. Anger, you see somewhere around 6 months. And fear, again, this stranger distress, and you will see it in crying or some kind of an avoidance reaction. So when you look beyond infancy into toddlerhood, the developments that you see go hand in hand with our cognitive development, and parental influences shape emotional expressions differently according to gender. Again, we have some very interesting influences in our society on what gender roles are and what emotions are assigned to those. Emotional display rules, right? The series of rules that dictate what emotions are appropriate are learned. Shame, guilt, pride, envy. Those are things that come forward in young children. Um, and they oftentimes do not have an understanding at this point between what they feel and what they express. Preschool kids employ these rules. This is how I'm supposed to act, but they don't always understand them in terms of the whys and the wherefores. One of the things the book really speaks to is the development of emotional understanding and social referencing. In other words, using other people's emotional expressions as a source for information. Within our communicative loop, we have these references that become available, and they are first kind of observed by behavioral psychologists somewhere around 12 months or a year old. One of the things, it's the experiment that you see is that depth perception cliff. When the mom is posing happy or frightened, seeing the baby get towards that stepping off point. The social referencing also involves expression in terms of facial as well as tone of voice. So think about how we react as adults or siblings to infants, toddlers, in terms of socially, and how they are influenced by how we react to various surroundings. So as we go forward in development, sometime around age 2, you're looking at, there's a element of what we'd call self-conscious emotion. Those are such things like guilt and shame and envy and embarrassment and pride. And they emerge out of their developing sense of self-awareness at around 2 years old. And these emotions actually require children to consider lots of different factors in a situation. Our emotional regulation is really the capacity to function in a variety of spaces and places to regulate emotion. So, in other words, when you talk about emotional regulation, it's that individual emotional arousal that needs to be maintained within children's capacity to cope. And so you have to really look at how children, especially at a very young age, are cognitively developed in order for them to deal with certain situations, coping mechanisms. They're looked at in terms of intrinsic processes and extrinsic processes. In other words, the intrinsic process are developed within the individual's capacity to self-regulate as they engage in voluntary kind of managing their emotions. Intrinsic are factors outside. In other words, how others soothe them in situations, how others give them opportunities to talk about their feelings, and somewhat that cultural or environmental prescriptions on how they are supposed to act depending on the situation. So we talk a lot about, in development of this, emotion, a child's emotional development, and a child's emotional intelligence, much like sort of a mental intelligence, but how they can show their understanding of their own emotions. It's rooted in Gardner's sort of proposal of multiple forms of intelligence. And really, you're looking at 5 domains: knowing one's own feelings, using and managing feelings in a manner appropriate to a given situation, self-motivation to behave in ways to meet a goal, recognizing emotions in others, and building and maintaining positive relationships with others. So there are interventions that exist that help children identify and understand their feelings. Um, and those feelings are very much linked with how they feel and what their relationships with others are. So as you look at this, this is sort of a synopsis of emotional expression and emotional understanding. Next, we turn to the family. And again, I cannot emphasize enough the power and the influence of a family context for a child to thrive emotionally. And that family can look in very different for different people. So really, when you look at there are direct influences and that there are indirect influences. The direct influence is the form of interaction and discipline that either promotes the child's sense of well-being or can undermine it. Indirect influences are family relationships, sibling relationships, um, and marital relationships, which do have strong indirect influences on that child. And again, these influences are bidirectional. Adults influence children's behavior and experiences, as well as children also have that influence on behavior and responses of adults. I'm going to pause this for one moment as I go back to my notes. Okay, back again. In terms of the role of parents in developing infant trust, really, there are a couple of things that our readings are proposing. And one of them is sympathetic and loving caregiving. The ability when, the availability when needed, um, how that person helps an infant to expect the world to be good and gratifying. It helps the youngest of our children to feel good about venturing out, exploring. If they become used to the fact that the caregiver is there and is available when needed, it makes sense that the infant becomes confident about being willing to risk moving farther and farther away, because if they are in need of something, they feel confident that if they turn, the adult will be there for their rescue, so to speak, for help when needed. So infant trust has a great deal to do with sympathetic and loving availability of a caregiver in a child's environment. This also has to do with the role of developing toddler autonomy as the child is growing up. Even though the child wants to do things themselves, it's somewhat all about me. I can do it. Um, and that's sort of the biggest role in line from a toddler, right? The toddler still needs suitable guidance, um, reasonable choices that are guided by the adult in their environment. It appears that over-controlling and under-controlling in these situations result in children who doubt themselves and their abilities. So if an adult is overprotective and says things like, "Oh, I'll do it for you," the child starts to question whether they have the ability to do it or not. If the parent is just hands off, not involved at all, then the child worries about risk, because there's no one there in turn to assist and protect them. So it appears that the parent is really kind of walking a fine line between being too overprotective and too hands-on. So once again, this ongoing role of a parent in being either too much or too little. In terms of social and emotional regulation, once again, the parent is trying to walk a fine line in terms of offering a comfortable level of intensity in order to give the child the best place to learn in order to emotionally self-regulate. The child needs to learn how to calm themselves, and children also need to learn how to regulate their own emotional level. You can't be all over the child saying it's okay, it will be all better, because the child needs to learn how to soothe themselves. And the difficulty is that you can't be whatever, um, go take care of yourself. Again, you can see that parents have this fine line that they're walking about, am I doing too much? Am I doing too little? Am I giving this child the right amount of guidance? It's figuring out the appropriate balance in between what's too much and too little. In terms of promoting a positive self-concept and self-esteem, we can kind of need to really promote high self-esteem because that relates to the child's ability to have initiative. A child's ability to roll up their sleeves, to move forward, to be willing to try and do things in order to have this kind of positive self-image and self-esteem. They really need to be able to have this promoted at home. They need to have a good sense of themselves, to come in and get a sense of self-confidence from the most significant people in their lives at that point, which would be their caregivers and their parents. In terms of child developing social and emotionally, parents are scaffolding with the child to reflect on things like cause and consequence. So modeling related to what do mature emotional communication skills look like? How do you talk about your feelings? How do you communicate about your feelings with others? And what does emotional self-regulation look like? What do you as an adult do if you get really angry? How do you calm yourself down? How do you deal with your own emotions? If you always just go away into another room and hide any kind of emotional issues from children, they don't have a chance to see that. They don't have a chance to see what it looks like to have to work through the issues in emotional times. If you go through these things in front of a child, then a child has an opportunity to see the emotions how they're processed, and what people do to when they're going through difficult times, and that they do come out the other end of those. So this adult scaffolding, this adult modeling, is something that's helpful for children to see. When they go through things themselves, they will then have the models to be able to use and successfully negotiate real situations. In terms of social problems and social problem solving, again, it's about modeling, discussing alternatives in real situations. How do you negotiate problem solving skills? Is it just being angry, walking away, slamming the door? Then we can't be surprised in a way if children then go forward and do that same thing they've been seeing. You have to think about what we model in front of children and that we're their model. So it's not surprising that they learn from what they observe. So in the role of moral behavior, once again, we have to understand that we adults are the biggest role models. As children have the ability to reason, and as that reasoning develops, there have to be discussions about moral behavior. But talk is cheap if they don't observe these behaviors on our part. So we need to model, we need to reinforce moral behavior. If we want our children to act a certain way, we need to see them acting that way. We can't just say, this is what I want you to do in these circumstances. They need to see us doing that in these circumstances. So in other words, it's do as I do. You can't say, do something if you're not willing to do it. Our role in gender stereotyping, well, it's about promoting flexible beliefs. If we only give certain kinds of toys to boys or only give certain kinds of toys to girls, only let boys do certain kinds of activities and only let girls do certain kind of activities, we promote gender stereotyping. But there are some things that, regardless of what we promote, what we say, what we model, seem to continue to be characteristic. So the book points out some interesting illustrations of those kinds of things. One of the things that you really want to make sure is that you take into account that there is a cultural context to emotional development. Different cultures have different standards, and those standards vary in what is appropriate expression. So oftentimes it forces socialization differences between boys and girls depending on the culture that our children grow up in. Development of attachment, again, Bowlby was one of the first to talk about the theory between the relationship between caregiver and infant. And again, it focuses on the processes that lead to bonding and the impact of psychological development as children go forward. As time has evolved, Ainsworth in the 70s discussed emotional attachment relationship in terms of infants who use adults as both safe havens and secure baselines. It's not only do adults provide a source of refuge and comfort when distressed, but it's also a vantage point for which children can then go forward and explore their environment, knowing that there's a caring other making sure that they're safe. So there are different types of quality of attachments that that have been measured, and I'm not going to read this for you, but I want you to very much make aware that we're looking at different uh, strengths, I think, along a spectrum of from secure attachment to insecure and disorganized. And it does have a massive impact on how that child goes forward in their development. Some of the original studies that have been done in middle class families found that there was stability over time in attachment from infant to about 6. When more diversity is included, there's less evidence of stability over time. Stressful events um, can be associated with changes in attachment classifications from the previous slide. What I want you to think about is that there can be this swing, this bidirectional from secure to insecure, depending on events, outside forces, the stability in environment. And so I think one of the key things to note is that the stability of the child's attachment is really a function of the stability of the environment. So currently, I think that we've really come a long way because attachment theory now recognizes also the importance of fathers in the caregiver-child bond. There's so many benefits of secure attachment because it provides opportunities for us to really look at these kids. And when children go into preschool, kids who have more secure attachments are really rated to be less aggressive and less dependent. So to reap these benefits, children may only need to feel secure with one parent. And I think that is very reassuring for single mothers and stay-at-home fathers, as opposed to a very 20th century view of two-parent households. Infant attachment behaviors are not universal, interestingly enough, and are considered within the culture that children are raised. Okay, I'm going to give you a bit of a pause. Hi, I'm back again. When we talk about temperament, it's a characteristic of a child's emotional nature, and it's very important to sort of understand that there are very much differences within us as individuals, of the different types of temperaments that we have. There's reactivity, in other words, how quick and intense an emotional arousal is. There's the ability to self-regulate, and those strategies that come about with how we are able to modify our reactions. In the late 1970s, Thomas and Chess actually classified infants to be easy, difficult, and slow to warm. And I think this whole concept is really important when we talk about child rearing, and really how we discuss the ongoing role of parents in terms of temperament. So when we look at the social emotional concepts here, it's really how temperament can change. It's somewhat how the parental expectation of behavior is towards that child. In households where parents experience problems in coping with difficult kids, they may reinforce the undesired behaviors. Alternatively, in households where parents are calm and able to respond positively to kids' temperaments, excuse me. Pardon me. As I was saying, alternatively, in households where parents are calm and able to respond positively to kids' temperaments, there's a really good chance of influencing and altering kids' behaviors. And research on this concept is really kind of mixed, and it's really difficult to really know exactly what this reciprocal relationship and how it has an impact on kids. So when we look at this goodness to fit idea, it reminds us that babies have unique dispositions in their own right, and adults need to kind of accept that. Parents can neither take the full credit for their children's virtues nor be blamed for all their faults, but parents can turn an environment that exaggerates kids' problems into one that builds on their strengths. So take a look at all of the things that your book I'm sorry, I'm a bit distracted. Take a look at what your book and how your book talks about this in terms of parenting, and think about how in your own families you have come to different types of processes that have made you the person that you are today. So I will close this chapter, and we will talk in the next video about chapter 11.